Hey there everyone, it's Addicted to Nature. Today I'm going to be talking about the cost, benefit, pros and cons of a CO2 system. And by that I mean a low-tech, do-it-yourself, you either mix your own reagents together to create CO2 or you buy the canisters, the disposable canisters, and have pressurized CO2 that way, or versus a high-tech, refillable CO2 system with a regulator, a solenoid bubble counter in the tank, the CO2 tank you would get somewhere like a brewery or a gas company. Pros and cons of each versus their cost, what you should be considering before you spend the money, because I know either way it's gonna be kind of expensive. And so this tank in front of you is the high-tech tank. It's got CO2 infused in it. I run this about 2 bubbles every 3 seconds, so about 0.67 bubbles a second. Now, it's doing fine. Plants are growing great with CO2, and if you have a planted tank and you want luscious, rich growth of all your different plants, you're gonna want to have some sort of CO2. If you don't want CO2 or you don't have the room for it, definitely consider watching my top 5 non-CO2 planted tank or plants for planted tanks video, which I will link down below. And without any other interruptions, let's get started on some math. Alright, so the first thing that you should think about before you get CO2 is, do you absolutely need it? What does this hobby mean to you? And what I mean is, if you are someone who's mainly thinking about keeping fish, right, breeding fish, maybe selling them a little bit, just you want a lot of fish, CO2 might not be your #1 choice of an upgrade. For example, if you are someone who breeds African cichlids and you like African cichlids and you want a big African cichlid aquarium, CO2 might not work for you, because once you plant out the plants that are now rooted in the substrate and then your African cichlids come digging around, boom, the plants are gone and the CO2 is sort of not really very useful, right? And you want to also think about what sort of things can I get other than CO2? If you have a bad light, if you don't have a high light setup, get the light first. If you don't have good substrate, get the substrate first. CO2 should really be something where you've got your light, you've got your substrate, you've got a planted tank setup. You've got a tank where the plants are the main focus, right? Because if you're, and it doesn't have to be as extreme as African cichlids. If you want guppies or cherry shrimp or bettas or any of that stuff, you can breed those things in a perfect fish tank without CO2. And so CO2 should really be everything that you've considered, and then you get CO2, right? And it's not just what this hobby means to you, it's also how long do you plan on being in this hobby? How many tanks do you plan on having? A lot of people are like, I'm good with 1 or 2, so I'm just gonna get a small setup. And then a couple months down the line, they've got 3 more tanks, and now they have to upgrade to a bigger setup. And then their old setup they have to sell at a very cheap price because it's used. And as we all know, in this hobby, a lot of times used goes for almost 20-30% of the price of what you got. So plan for upgrades in the future. And then also think about, am I living with little kids? Am I living with pets? Am I living in an apartment with roommates that don't like to see this big CO2 cylinder in the living room? Because I can think about places where, kids knock something over, or dogs, birds, they just like to chew on things, and then they start chewing on one of your CO2 tubings, and you don't figure out until you get home and you're like, dang, now I gotta go buy more tubes, right? So keep all that stuff in mind while you're thinking about when you're getting CO2 while you're watching this video. And then, so now I'm going to do an analysis on the price. Now there are two things that I'm going to compare. One's the DIY sort of system, and with that I've chosen to, and yeah, I'm aware that there are things where you can use, Coke bottles and mix and match different ingredients, and then have them going for about a week or two, and then you gotta switch them out. And then, yes, it's very cheap when you start out, but the cost of the refills add up every month, okay? But the system that I'm going to use as a standard for the DIY setup is the Flooville 42 gram or 45 gram CO2 system. You can usually get this at Petco, you can usually get this at PetSmart, you can order it online, but that's going to be the standard for the DIY. And then I'm going to use my setup as the sort of the higher tech CO2 setup, because that's a setup that I'm familiar with, that I can tell you all the pros and cons of, and that I have the exact pricing for. So here we go, let's do some math. Alright, so let's start with the Flooville 45 setup. At a local store in my area, and this is current of January 2020, where I live, the Flooville is $49.99. So we're just going to say it's going to be $50 when you first start out. Okay, so this is the setup. It includes the CO2, it includes a tube, a really small regulator, which is the little gauge on the top, and a diffuser. So you have all of these things for $50. And then the CO2 cartridge is about $15 for every refill. So what that means is you are spending $15 every couple weeks. Now, I didn't have this ever before, so I went online, saw some reviews, and the consensus is it lasts about 1 to 2 weeks. And most people were saying 1 week, but for the purposes of this, we're gonna do 2 weeks. Okay, it's just so that say you manage to get it down to 2 weeks. So $15 every 2 weeks. $15 every 2 weeks. That means we have $30 a month. $30 a month. Okay, so let's try to find out how much money you spend in a year. For the first year, we are doing 50 for our original setup, added to 30 times 12. And that means it's $50. That's a terrible 5. It is $50 plus $360 in refills. That means we're doing, for the first month or for the first year, it's $410 for the first year, and every other year after that, it's $360 if you plan on running this setup. And this setup is, think about it, you have one tank, right? You only have one tank, and these disposable cylinders are designed for the Flooville system, which means that you can't really swap out another sort of cylinder. You can't go upgrade into a paintball cylinder. You can't upgrade into a 10-pound CO2 kit. You have to either stick with the Flooville cylinders, or you need to get a whole new setup. Think about it, $410. Okay. Now let's talk about the other one that I mentioned in this video before. It is the more high-tech one, the one I have, okay? So this is what I did. I have, number one, the regulator, which was $160. Brand new, it's a dual stage, and when you're thinking about regulators, dual stage is better than single stage. Another video on that, but try to get a dual stage, okay? It doesn't have to be $160. It could be $100. Anywhere between 100 and 200 is good. My $160 one was actually on sale, so it was $199, but on sale it was $160, okay? And then what I did was I had a 10 pound CO2 tank, and that was $120. Okay, so this was for the regulator. I'm just gonna do REGUL, regulator, and then this was for the 10 pound CO2 tank. Okay, this was empty. And then when you have these CO2 tanks, you need to fill them up. And where I live, a refill or a first fill, doesn't matter, on this 10 pound CO2 tank costs $20. It could be more, it could be less. Most of the time, it's gonna be around $20 for a 10 pound CO2 tank. Okay, so you're not done yet because the diffuser, all that stuff was included in this $50, but you have to buy it here. So we're just gonna go on Amazon, where everyone else gets their diffusers, and we're gonna buy the diffuser, the tubing, the check valve, and if your regulator did not include a bubble counter, you need to buy a bubble counter too, right? So for me, I spent about, about $30 on all of that stuff. The diffuser was the main, was a big part of these $30, okay? So all of that stuff added together, what do you have now? So 160 plus 280, 300, 330. Okay, so overall, your total here would be 300, I'm not gonna put that negative there, 300, oh my gosh, was 300, what is going on with my, $330, that's terrible, $330. $330, and with this regulator it included the bubble counter, so I didn't need to spend extra money on the bubble counter. It included a solenoid, which is important if you don't want to do this where you turn it on and off every single day. A solenoid is essentially a sort of a valve that if you plug it in and there's electricity running through it, the valve is open, CO2 can flow through, and then when there's no electricity, the solenoid's valve is closed, no CO2 can flow through. So you can imagine if you plug the solenoid into a timer, during the day you turn it on, CO2 can flow. And then at the night, if the timer goes off, the solenoid doesn't have any more electricity, no power, and no CO2 can flow through the tubing into your tank. So completely automatic, don't have to worry about it. And boom, all for $330. This is for the first year, right? So my 10 pound CO2 cylinder is going on my 10-gallon tank. And I run this for about, like I said, two bubbles every 3 seconds, okay? And I have not really noticed a difference in the amount of CO2 that I've had for the past month, 2 months, almost down to the 3-month mark. It's very, very little CO2 that I've used. So this thing can last me more than a year for $330, whereas the Flooville 45 gram, and like I said, this is just a standard placeholder for the DIY systems. For the other DIY systems, you might have to buy more of the reagents. And a lot of times I've heard that with this specific system, if you go on the reviews and read about it, there's a very high chance that it might leak. You might run out of the canister in the first day, 2 days or so, but we're just, for the sake of this math, we're saying that you managed to get it working for 2 weeks after a little bit of trial and error, right? That which might even drive up your cost even more. So $410 on the first year versus $330. you can see that the prices aren't cheap for either setups. But over the long run, if you are planning or if you're planning to keep this hobby going, if you're someone who really likes planted tanks, you might want to invest in a higher tech setup from the beginning. So what I did was, it took me a long time to save up this money, but hey, when I got to it, right now I have no regrets. I'm so glad I came and I went with this setup instead of the Flooville one, which I had been looking for when I was trying to decide what I wanted to do. So thank you guys so much for watching. This is Addicted Nature. If I helped you decide, leave a comment down in the below with any other questions. If I can answer them, I'll be sure to do it. And if you think this has been helpful, please leave a like and subscribe. Thanks.